animals in the wild are subject to endless torment from all angles of their existence.
Yeah, sure, I totally buy that. No, I mean, come on, seriously? Does Cosmic Skeptic really think that we're gonna fall for his emotional appeal? That all animals from the moment they're born until they die are endlessly tormented?
Oh, that's hyperbole.
Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to take a look at a video put out by Lukas over at his Clickbait apologetics channel, Deflate, where he addresses a poll that he found over in the community tab of the atheist experience. The question posed in that poll was, if a god existed, would you worship it? Now, you wouldn't think that such a simple question wouldn't get Lukas here all riled up. But apparently he thinks that the tallied outcome of that poll not only exposes atheists as being intellectually dishonest, but also validates his belief in his Bible. So let's dive in and see if Lukas actually has his eye on the ball, or if, like most apologetics videos, he's just barking up the wrong tree.
A video about why 85% of atheists reject evidence is definitely a risky thing to put out there.
That's certainly an interesting concession you're making there, Lukas. If it were in fact the case that 85% of self-identifying atheists were intellectually dishonest and thus just rejecting evidence, then there wouldn't really be any risk there for you because you could just present the evidence that they're willfully rejecting. You know, that pesky evidence that they keep asking for? You could demonstrate the accurate predictive models that are developed from the application of that evidence, and by virtue of those accurate predictions, their denial of reality would be exposed. However, if it is not the case that 85% of self-identifying atheists are simply rejecting evidence, then the only way that your video response here could be a risky endeavor is if it's really all just a massive misrepresentation of either the issue at hand, atheism, or both.
But if you think that this is just about me taking a swipe at atheists while letting Christians off the hook, you're mistaken.
Well, I wouldn't want to automatically assume that your video will be pretty much like all other apologetics videos that claim to understand what atheism is and what it entails when it actually doesn't.
Watch till the end and you'll find out why.
Despite your assurances, I'm inclined to think that I won't have to wait until the end of the video to figure out if this whole thing is just a complete misrepresentation.
But first things first, from where do I get this idea that 85% of atheists reject evidence?
Well, if this is anything like any other statistic that apologists tend to glom onto, then the likelihood is that it was cherry-picked to be presented out of context.
A while ago, I stumbled upon a YouTube poll run by Matt Dillahunty's Atheist Experience. The question, would you worship a god if it were real? Why or why not?
I actually remember seeing this poll when it dropped, but that's only because I have the bell clicked and notifications enabled. But if this video is going where I think it's going, I think you may have missed or are deliberately ignoring the entire point of the question.
Some 3,000 people answered yes, and some 16,000 or 85% said no.
Yep, and I was one of those 85% that answered no.
I'm perfectly aware that this is not a representative survey, properly speaking. And maybe if this poll were run on another atheist channel or outside of YouTube, more people would say yes.
Unfortunately, your statement there not only gives further credence to the notion that you either missed or are completely ignoring the entire point of the question, but taken on its face is a rather harsh indictment of the general intelligence of humanity.
Even so, at the very least, this poll suggests that evidence for God, or the supposed lack thereof, is not actually what lies at the heart of why Matt's followers reject God.
Is he serious?
Yeah, that is not at all what that poll suggests. And I think I'm in a good enough position to assume that your indoctrinated bias is what is contributing to you drawing this false conclusion.
Since by their own admission, even if they knew him to be real, they still wouldn't worship him. Why is this so?
I'm not gonna lie to you. The answer to why that is the case should have been exceptionally easy to parse out. Really, the only way you couldn't have seen the answer is if you were approaching the question with a bias that blinds you to it.
Well, here are 3 of the over 2,000 comments appearing under the poll.
I can already tell you, Lucas, you're not going to find the answer in a 0.15% sample of the comment section.
Worship has been one of the most destructive forces known to mankind. Depends on which, I would have several questions if it were the Muslim Christian God. Why would a perfect God want worship?
Now at this point, there's something I feel I have to make note of here. I wanted to make sure that Lucas wasn't simply quote mining from the comment section and taking people's words out of context. So I went back to AXP's community tab to hunt down that poll and verify those comments myself. But even though the community tab goes back 2 years, this particular poll is not on there anymore. And to make sure I covered all my bases, I scoured all of AXP's socials and I can't find that poll anywhere. Suffice to say, I was not able to confirm that what Lucas is posting in this video actually came from that comment thread. And given that he just typed them out himself instead of screenshotting them, I think it's safe to take these with a grain of salt.
I'm not going to respond to these comments here. However, I want to point out that they do raise very good questions which a Christian should take seriously.
Well, what you typed out there certainly does.
Now, the key issue to consider is the following. Why would someone who cares about evidence not worship God even if they knew him to be real?
Now, normally, if this were an actual conversation, I would probably pause everything and have you ask that question again slowly while actively listening to what it is you're asking.
Why would someone who cares about evidence not worship God even if they knew him to be real?
The answer is literally right there in front of you.
I suggest it's ultimately because they want to be the masters of their own life at all costs.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong.
Yeah, that would be that bias clouding your reason that I mentioned earlier. And frankly, Lucas, you would be hard-pressed to convince me that this was just some innocuous mistake on your part, because you've been called out numerous times for misrepresenting atheists on a number of issues. The question being presented in the poll is not, if the Christian God exists, would people automatically worship it? But simply, if a God exists, meaning any God at all, would people automatically worship it? The very obvious thing that you appear to be missing or ignoring here is that the poll is essentially asking if the mere existence of a God logically entails that you would or should worship it. And the answer to that is, of course, a resounding no. And even if it was a demonstrated fact that the God in question was the Christian God, that alone would not logically entail that the entity is automatically worthy of worship. Its worthiness is an entirely separate question from its existence. In point of fact, Lucas, this was actually alluded to in that second purported comment that you cited, and then conveniently chose not to address.
I'm not going to respond to these comments here.
The answer was literally sitting there right in front of you, which, if I'm being completely honest here, indicates to me that you are fully aware that worthiness of worship is not logically entailed by the mere existence of a God. Just as I don't think that you would automatically worship Allah if that were the God demonstrated to exist. So once again, you are allowing the indoctrinated bias of your worldview to inform your representation of atheists.
Even at the rather high intellectual cost of denying plain facts.
Now that we know that you're predicating this entire response upon a non sequitur, I'm really curious what facts you think you have can fix this issue.
Why do I think that?
Because as a non sequitur, the conclusion is fallacious and reasoning fallaciously is irrational.
Well, part of what it means to worship is admitting that what you worship has authority over you.
This is completely irrelevant to the question at hand because you've completely ignored the question itself and jumped the gap by assuming that if the God were to actually exist, it would automatically be worthy of worship. Also, possessing authority over someone does not logically entail worship either. That question of worthiness must be definitively answered before a rational conclusion can be arrived at.
Thus, the refusal to make this admission while facing the hard evidence that God is in fact real is essentially saying that still you don't want to let God be in charge.
You see, that's a positive claim and should be addressed immediately. Because if you don't address it by presenting this evidence, then you're just strawmanning atheists as people who actually know that a God exists and are rejecting it on purely irrational grounds. It's cult validating nonsense straight out of the Book of Romans.
In other words, turning your back on the evidence that God exists is the price you pay for staying in charge.
Which you have yet to present here, by the way, and is completely irrelevant because the question posed by the poll is starting from the position that the God God has already been demonstrated to exist, which naturally implies that sufficient evidence for its existence has already been attained. You're so desperate to run away from the actual issue of a lack of logical entailment that the question was initially presenting that you're now openly misrepresenting the very question you sought to respond to.
This seems to be what Thomas Nagel, an eminent atheist philosopher, echoes with refreshing honesty.
Let's see if Lukas here actually cites Nagel correctly.
It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that.
This particular quote from Nagel appears in his work, The Last Word, published in 1997. Now, first and foremost, it must be pointed out that not all atheists think like Nagel does nor hold his opinions. So obviously, implying that Nagel's words represent all atheists would be a fallacy of composition. This would be akin to claiming that all geneticists around the world believe the Earth to be 6,000 years old, simply because the once lauded, now disgraced geneticist John C. Sanford is himself a young Earth creationist. Also, it's important to note that there is a very, very specific reason why Nagel feels this way about religion in general. Born in 1937 in what was then Yugoslavia to German Jewish refugees, Nagel's upbringing was directly informed by the very horrors of World War II that drove his family to escape certain death in their home country. So while Nagel's personal take on the overall dangers of religion and religious ideology don't represent all atheists everywhere, I think it's safe to say that his personal take is more than justified, given his and his family's personal experiences during a time in which a dictatorial monster, through unspeakable atrocity after unspeakable atrocity, declared himself that by divine providence he was the authority over all. This is of course not to say that just because religious thinking can be twisted by twisted individuals for unspeakable ends that all religion should be outlawed, but only that if Lukas had done the actual research into the person that he wanted to quote, then he likely would have realized that Nagel's inherent, though completely understandable bias would have precluded him from being a good source.
Of course, my conclusion about why 85% of Matt's followers answered no might be wrong, so let me know your thoughts in the comments.
No, it is in fact wrong, but I'll give you credit for at minimum feigning intellectual honesty, and credit to his comment section because they have certainly let him know how wrong he is.
More importantly, let me also say that a lot of atheists and agnostics I know, not the least from among you friendly folks who watch and comment on my videos, would be more than happy, I believe, to worship God once they became convinced of his existence.
Again, that's not what the poll was asking, and anyone who would automatically conclude that a god, especially the Christian Yahweh monster, was worthy of worship simply by virtue of existing, has either never read the Bible, or is simply falling in line with what is ostensibly a ruthless dictator purely out of fear.
Well, this was definitely the case with this person, for example, who contacted me to tell me that while he started out as an agnostic, he came to believe in Christianity, now attends church, and that this channel has had significant influence on his journey toward Christ.
Come on, man. Save the self-indulgent masturbation for your OnlyFans.
So maybe if I ran a poll among atheists on my channel with the same question, we might get a different ratio than the 85-15 one you see on Matt's platform.
While the platform that a poll is being presented on can lead to a biased interpretation of the data, I would hazard, Lukas, that you're assuming your conclusion because of your own bias. If the general population as a whole is more intellectually honest than not, then regardless of the platform, the results are generally going to be about the same, because the majority of people answering the poll will recognize that the question is about logical entailment, and not about rejecting evidence that a god exists.
Setting all of that aside for a moment, what might be the most important thing to realize here is that Christians like myself may actually sit in the no camp more often than we would like to admit.
Well, given that you literally define your god as being worthy of worship, the only logical reason you'd have for voting no is if the god being presented in the question was not your god, which of course is not what this question is presenting.
What do I mean? Well, I said that part of what it means to worship is admitting that what you worship has authority over you.
Sure, in the Christian worldview, worship implies an acknowledgement of authority, but back in reality, the mere act of creation does not logically entail authority, as the designation of authority is of course context dependent, and even if the context did determine a position of authority, that position of authority does not logically entail a worthiness worthiness of worship, as that worthiness would also be context dependent.
I also suggested that the no's of the 85% amounts to the refusal to make this admission, even if one had actually come to realize that God is real, and that this refusal is ultimately rooted in the atheist's desire to remain in charge of him or herself, rather than letting God take over.
Yes, you came to a false conclusion through a fallacious external critique. The entire topic of this conversation was about worthiness of worship and how mere existence does not logically entail such an attribute. But as a result of your bias, you've assumed that a subjective theological interpretation applies equally to the non-theistic worldview. And thus, your entire response video here about accepting evidence has no relation to the topic at hand. And the reason you've done this, Lukas, is because a legitimate external critique won't actually work, because what you're arguing are subjective theological aspects of your own worldview, which are not agreed to in the non-theistic worldview, because to hold them would require begging the question. And an internal critique won't work here either, because the non-theistic worldview poses no logical contradiction. This really only leaves you with two options. Either crack open the SEP and brush up on your basic philosophy, or stop treating that ninth commandment that you so often boast is a universal as a conditional.
With this in mind, isn't it true that as a Christian, every time you disobey Christ, especially when doing so willingly, you're essentially refusing to let God be in charge?
Well, that's something that Christians have to contend with. And if the day comes that what they think is being commanded conflicts with their own moral intuitions, they'll have to square that one way or another. But I do appreciate you confirming that your target audience for this video was not atheists, but in fact your own echo chamber.
Isn't you doing your own thing instead of Christ's thing? Giggity. Essentially you saying no to worshipping God even though he is real?
You still have yet to even present that evidence. But since you made this video specifically with the intent of selling your fellow Christians their validation back to them, I don't anticipate you actually backing up any of your assertions with anything substantive.
Let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments. Sure, I believe it's worthwhile to ponder why some atheists, like the 85% of Matt's poll, would continue to reject God even if they became convinced of his existence.
To answer the question again, it's because existence doesn't entail worthiness of worship. So the rejection of worshiping this entity, were it demonstrated to actually exist, has nothing to do with the evidence that supports its existence, but in the lack of evidence that this entity is even worthy of basic respect, let alone worship.
However, for a Christian like myself, it's probably more important to consider whether there's a log in my own eye and whether I may end up in somewhat the same boat as those 85% whenever I don't let God be in charge.
No, the log in your own eye is your bias, or your deliberate dishonesty. I'll let the audience make up their minds on that one. Now from here, Lukas just repeats his claim that his God is real, and then asserts that more and more people these days are walking away from the church because they are not pushing his message here. When in fact, as these statistics bear out, it's the anti-equality positions and antisocial behaviors of Christian denominations, especially those of the fundamentalist persuasion, as well as the population's increased awareness of the irrational nature of faith and the incoherency of God concepts that are steadily driving people away from the church, which frankly is a good thing. Now, to bridge the divide, the effort here is pretty simple. If you're going to address the reasoning behind a person's decision, try not to assume things about how they're reasoning to a conclusion to be true just because your ideological bias wants you to. When you can acknowledge the aspects of another person's worldview, you can achieve a better understanding of where the other person is coming from. But when you openly misrepresent the other side in an effort to just sell validation to your audience, then all you'll end up demonstrating is that you're simply more interested in being believed and followed than you are in the truth. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, November is Homeless Youth Awareness Month. A link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you like what you saw here and would like to support me further, the links to channel membership and to get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear are also in the description. Once again, a massive thank you to each and every single one of you for your continued support. And as always, be safe, be excellent to each other. And together, we can bridge the divide.